So we're going to jump back into the closing statement provided by Hudgells on behalf of some of the convicted sub-postmasters. And in this part, we analyse how the sub-postmasters asked for help and the post office refused to listen and, in fact, turned their own pleas for help against them. Let's jump into the inquiry.
And just go into those faults now with investigations and investigators. Sub-postmasters told post office investigators, security managers, that there were unexplained discrepancies, or they blamed the system outright. The post office did not listen or refuse to hear, and we make a number of points about their approach. The inquiry might conclude that post office investigators, security managers, were underqualified, ill-trained and under-supervised. The inquiry heard of the short weeks of training completed in-house, followed by mentoring in-house, which it might conclude perpetuated a particular brand of post office practice. Interviews with suspects, which were fundamental to the post office prosecutorial approach, were handled unprofessionally, both in their conduct and their presentation, for the purposes of prosecutorial decision-making and for trial. Following the theme of the default position in the contract that the postmaster was responsible for all losses, there was an apparent default assumption of fault and dishonesty in the face of any horizon discrepancy. The inquiry saw it in the interviews of David Blakey, inexplicably asked about whether he had been in an adulterous relationship and faced with the suggestion that his ill wife would be investigated. And Alison Hall, whose position was not 100%, whose position that Horizon was not 100%, was not reflected in her suspect offender report, to name just two examples, and even saw the investigators asking Lynette Hutchings why it was that she did not have a solicitor based locally to her, but instead had retained the services of Izzy Hogg, who had represented Joe Hamilton, Seema Misra and others. Time and again, postmasters were aggressively accused of lying simply because they could not explain where the money had gone. The interviewer would typically ask, "Where has the money gone?" The postmaster would reply, "I don't know," to which the interviewer would respond, "You're lying." Investigators faced with challenges to Horizon repeatedly failed to explore reasonable lines of inquiry, and the failure to explore reasonable lines of inquiry went beyond challenges to Horizon data. Investigators were not trained in the operation of Horizon, nor in the role of the audit trail. They were not technically qualified. When Horizon issues were explored, the post office was completely reliant on Fujitsu for the answer. Fujitsu was relied on to explain away any questions. It marked its own homework. The handling of expert evidence by post office investigators, supported by Fujitsu, was fundamentally and irretrievably flawed and inconsistent with the requirements of fairness and proper criminal procedure. No expert declaration, for example. Moreover, there's no question that the security team were aware of repeated challenges to Horizon integrity. Any suggestion that cases were never discussed or that the team was unaware of the challenges in the press ought to be treated with contempt, we say. And there'll be no need to remind the inquiry that we had the truly extraordinary evidence of Mr. Ward yesterday as to his involvement in the proposed expert evidence of Gareth Jenkins in the case of Noel Thomas. Investigators' handling of ordinary witness evidence was often fundamentally and irretrievably flawed as well, and inconsistent with the requirements of fairness and proper criminal procedure. We have in mind, for example, that Stephen Bradshaw allowed Cartwright King to write and serve his statements for him, even though he did not agree with the contents. And the inquiry will remember the evidence of Catherine Oglesby, who appeared almost astonished that anybody would even think that she would have been responsible for what was in her own signed statement. Investigators' handling of disclosure, including requests from the defence, was also irretrievably flawed and inconsistent with the requirements of fairness, justice and proper criminal procedure. And investigators actively helped shape the prosecution approach to particular cases in order to protect the interests of the business to the detriment of the defendant. The inquiry heard numerous examples of investigators attending conferences with counsel and involved in discussions on plea, including at the door of the court. Stephen Bradshaw's self-appraisal in respect of Jacqueline MacDonald's prosecution was a case in point. In what he said was flamboyant language, he claimed to have persuaded counsel for the post office to have insisted on a trial of theft allegations rather than be content with Mrs. MacDonald's pleas to false accounting. And he did so in order to counter the postmaster's campaign. If her pleas to false accounting had been accepted, even though she was guilty of nothing, she might have avoided prison. As it was, a 47-year-old mother of two, of previous good character, she was sent into custody away from her children and family and had to endure all the indignities, which we won't elaborate upon here, that go with being confined to a closed prison. Mr. Bradshaw had no reason to be proud of himself. Financial investigation and the recovery of losses also played a significant, if not guiding role, in the conduct of criminal investigations and subsequent prosecutions. Yesterday, Mr. Ward was taken to POL 00121 the post-pub email, which speaks to the priority with which investigators were treating recovery. In the same thread, he talks up the benefits of POCA over a post-conviction compensation order because compensation orders had no teeth. Jed Harbison, another financial investigator, asked by Juliet McFarlane for a view on a possible plea for Joel Hamilton, said, "I'm never confident with false accounting charges in relation to recovery under POCA 2002, and the theft charge makes life so much easier." And we'll return to this later. And finally, the Post Office security team and individual investigators operated free from professional obligation and regulatory oversight. There was and is no independent office for police complaints for the Post Office police, the investigators. These policemen were accountable only to the company to which they were so loyal. There were thus numerous highly significant problems in the process of investigation and the actions of investigators, which this inquiry has heard evidence of, and we're only able to briefly touch upon them today.
At the heart of what they're saying here, they refuse to listen. Guilty until proven innocent. Sub-postmasters who were honest and said they couldn't explain shortfalls that Horizon was saying were automatically accused with lying on flimsy evidence at best. These sub-postmasters' lives were then subsequently torn apart piece by piece, financially, emotionally, health-wise, led to the breakdown of marriages, and sadly and tragically in some cases, the death of the people involved with these cases. What should have been warning signs? Allegations by postmasters that Horizon wasn't working, they couldn't explain what was happening, were ignored, and in fact the pleas for help that they placed to the people that they trusted, the post office, and subsequently Fujitsu through the post office, were then used against them to prosecute them. The discussion of charges on how things would be easier for the post office if they could upgrade charges to theft charges that we've heard from some witnesses they didn't even have the evidence to prove. And the shocking admission that despite guilty pleas from some sub-postmasters to charges of false accounting that they weren't guilty of, there was still attempts made by post office lawyers to raise the stakes further and increase the charges to ensure it was easier to recover money from them and that they would be sent to prison. This is the legacy that the post office have left behind here, a trail of destruction involving innocent people who didn't do anything wrong.